So my name's Samantha. My name is Luke. I am a volunteer with Abundant Housing LA. I am our LA our education director. It's something I've been doing for a few years. Again, volunteer capacity. I just do this in my spare time. I actually have a day job. Very grateful for that because it helps pay the bills. And yeah, that's actually in transportation policy. So not actually that far off from housing policy in terms of a lot of the issues that we see in our cities today. We have an agenda. This will be what I'll be going over today. The bulk of this Housing 101 is really around our history and then how that really shapes our present. There's a couple more things we'll touch on about our region and Abundant Housing LA's theory of change and some policy approaches we recommend. But really, the vast majority of the next hour and a half here is going to be about our housing history and how that shapes our present. This is a photo of St. Joseph's Hospital in Superior, Wisconsin. This is something I like to share, Samantha, because I actually I'm incredibly privileged as a white man to be able to be talking about housing, as we'll find out, for any number of reasons. But I also have experienced housing insecurity, including living a few years in this building when it was an abandoned hospital. It is now actually now no longer. It's been demolished. But I think housing. I note this at the start of the presentation because for us, for anyone who's coming to the conversation around housing, each one of us has our own story. Each one of us has our own history that shapes how we experience housing, and it's incredibly personal. And I think it's just important to acknowledge that up front because it can be really difficult to sort of get into the technical weeds or the policy weeds and not still feel very personally affected by it. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. So I'm going to actually show a quick video here. So I'm going to stop my sharing and share something else.
What's something that's clearly a scam, but Americans have been conditioned to believe is normal?
This. And this. And this. This. And this. Richest country in the world, and we choose to build our communities to look like this. This is so soul-crushing. You know what all these areas have in common? They're built for cars. We completely neglected public transportation and instead chose to publicly subsidize car ownership by building thousands of miles of roads and highways and parking lots. Also those small town like Main Street vibes that people like to glorify as small town America. Yeah, that like this is like illegal in most rural and suburban places. Zoning codes have literally banned the density required in order to build nice main streets like that because density means apartments. Apartments mean renters, and renters mean ethnics and poors move into the neighborhood. So if you're mad at this, thank capitalism and racism.
So that is going to be central to a lot of the themes that we'll be hearing throughout this presentation. That one of the core things here in our central ideas is that in the second piece of this slide here is that our housing policy is systemically racist and has been for a very, very long time. Systemically racist meaning that the systems of our housing policy result in outcomes that can only be explained by examining them through a lens of racism. There's no other way to explain a number of the outcomes that we see in housing policy, and it has been tried by many different people to try and explain it other ways, and there's just no other way to explain it. And that's true today as much as it was, in some cases even more so than it was 40, 50, 60 years ago. The first idea I've got listed out here of our core ideas for this presentation is that banning multifamily housing results in a number of challenges that we see around housing unaffordability, homelessness, and wealth and opportunity disparities. I call this banning multifamily housing. Another way that we describe this is single-family zoning. And this is a map of the Southern California area, color coding pink and blue on this map, all areas that are zoned for residential uses. So cities zone for where people can put housing or not. And in the LA area, we have zoned, of our areas that are zoned for residential uses, 78% are zoned for single family housing, which means that no matter the size of the piece of land, you can put one and only one house on it for one family. And then about 22% across the LA area. And in the city of LA proper, about 25% are zoned for what we call multifamily, i.e., you could have two homes on a piece of property, or you could have an apartment building, or a condo building, or whatever. And I think so. Then this leads to this third central idea here that we need to distinguish between opinions that are individual and institutional. The institution, for instance, defines a family, right? So the zoning codes have to define what a family means. That is an institutional opinion. That is an opinion that is backed up by the courts, by laws. It's a legal definition versus like you or I might say, well, I think a family is this. Well, that doesn't freaking matter what you or I think a family is if it's not what the institutional opinion is. That I think it's just important for us to sort of understand that individual opinions are not the same thing as institutional opinions, and institutional opinions are what govern how our cities are built. So Los Angeles is an area that, as you can see from this headline, pioneered residential segregation and helped divide the country. And an article that was an article that just came out a couple months ago in the LA Times referenced a book by a guy named Douglas Flaming, where he wrote that the now classic view holds that in the late 1880s and about 1910, African Americans found LA to be a fairly open city. But after 1910, real estate restrictions on blacks increased and were difficult to surmount. As a historian, Lawrence DeGraff wrote, African Americans could and did live throughout the city and were much less concentrated in any one area in 1890 and 1900 than they would be after 1910. Or in the words of Charlotta Bass, the Negro settlers who were the first arrivals bought land and built beautiful homes in all sections of the city free from restrictions, but then came the Southern whites and blacks faced the old terror of racial hatred they had tried to forget. So this, I think, is important to acknowledge that while we see a lot of systemically racist outcomes in our housing policy today, that was not necessarily the way it was 140 years ago. We've created that in the last century, and by we, I'm pointing the finger directly at people who look and sound like me, who've held the levers of power in our city governments for a significant period of time. So in terms of our housing history, you don't need to memorize this, Samantha. This is just sort of to give a frame for how we're going to go through our history for the last century. And really, I just want to call out the three colored bars here along the timeline, so running through the middle here. There's to the left, there's a brown bar, and then in the middle there's a red bar, and then overlapping that to the right is an orangish bar. The brown bar is a period of time when we had explicitly racist policies and approaches to housing, i.e., in other words, if we literally had written into legal documents that someone who was white, only someone who was white could buy this house, or only someone who was black could live in this community. The area with the red bar is where there was this layer of separation. So it was what I would call implicitly racist, but not that far removed from explicitly racist. And it's an area that many of us now have heard the term redlining. Redlining was the law of the land for about 40 years. So 2 generations worth of folks lived under an era where we had implicitly racist policies around housing. And then the area with the orange bar is something that I'm roughly ascribing it to this period of time from the early 1960s to the mid 1980s. It's not easily definable, like a clear end and a beginning and a clear end. If anything, it's actually that you could extend that bar even further into around 2000. But that is an area of exclusionary zoning perpetuating our historically racist outcomes. So we really downzoned the heck out of all of our cities across the country, and especially here in Southern California. So let's dive into that timeline and what that looks like. Begin with the Supreme Court in 1917 in a decision called Buchanan v. Worley. And that decision, the Supreme Court outlawed explicit race-based zoning. However, and so what that was saying, like, the city of Louisville had zoning, right, where they had city laws that said this is a white neighborhood and this is a black neighborhood. So if you were a black person wanting to purchase or rent a home in the white neighborhood, you were forbidden by the city zoning code from doing that, and vice versa. Supreme Court said, nope, that's not cool. You can't do that. However, they also touch anything else that might be ways to also discriminate on the basis of race and housing. So they said you can't do this by zoning, but they weren't exactly like really cool and down with, mixed race communities. And we see that as we move into the 1920s. This California was the inventor of single-family zoning. It was created in the city of Berkeley up in the Bay Area, and Los Angeles was an early adopter. We were one of the first cities to adopt zoning that specifically called for single-family zoning. We adopted this in the early 1920s. These were homes that were marketed to and restricted to white households. I've provided here a couple pamphlets from the time. We've all seen the Hollywood sign. The Hollywood sign was an advertisement for Hollywood land. And the brochure on the left is a brochure for Hollywood land from the 1920s, where they describe the community as protect your family by procuring at today's prices a home place in the hills of Hollywood land secured by fixed and natural restrictions against the inroads of metropolitanism. So, Samantha, what they're saying here is that when they say secured by fixed and natural restrictions, what they're describing in this brochure, the natural restrictions are basically it's a little ways away from downtown, and it's in the hills, so you probably need a car. But when they say fixed restrictions, what they're saying is every one of the homes or plots of land in Hollywood land has a deed restriction or a housing covenant, a deed restriction contained within a housing covenant that says only white people can purchase homes or resell homes or purchase land to build homes in this community. So Hollywood land, one of, at the time, dozens of new single-family communities being constructed that were restricted to exclusively to white home buyers and households. Eagle Rock was a little more explicit than Hollywood land in their brochure. On their second to last line of their brochure, they said the residents of Eagle Rock are all of the white or Caucasian race. These were the only two examples I could find from the LA area, but many of our single-family home communities began as subdivisions that were then absorbed within the city of Los Angeles. And they were designed and intended to be available strictly to white people. And in fact, the state, excuse me, I should stay on that slide for one more moment because it was the LA Realty Board which financed a case that set a national precedent in 1919 when the California Supreme Court ruled that an African American could buy a covenanted home but not live in it. In other words, the realtors in California had made sure that all of these types of housing projects, all of these types of single-family home subdivisions could be legally restricted strictly to white home buyers and resellers. So this was something that was done very much with this in mind as the design. And the U.S. Supreme Court backed up that action in 1926 with a decision called Corrigan v. Buckley, where they upheld racially restrictive covenants as enforceable by law. I also note the same year as Corrigan v. Buckley, another decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, Euclid v. Ambler. Many of us who are involved in planning have heard of Euclidean zoning. So when I keep referring to zoning, that is the result of this decision, Euclid v. Ambler, which is another Supreme Court decision in the same year that they said, yeah, go ahead and discriminate on the basis of race with single-family homes with their racially restricted covenants. The Supreme Court also upheld zoning for separating uses. And in that decision, they described apartment buildings as parasites, interfering with the free circulation of air and monopolizing the rays of sun which would otherwise fall upon the smaller homes. This was the same court that then a year later would go on to endorse eugenics and forced sterilization as a means of population control. So yeah, they were a really cool bunch and making decisions that really kind of were of an era, but really baked into our approach to housing policy, the kinds of things that we continue to do today, 100 years later. In Los Angeles, we saw a boom of housing construction in the 1920s. It was our most prolific decade for new housing construction, period, ever. We've never seen as much housing constructed in a single decade before or since. In a single year, in 1923, we constructed nearly 44,000 new homes across the city of Los Angeles. And you can see on this chart on the left-hand side where it dips pretty quickly down into the early 30s. That's the era of the Great Depression. Compare that to the more recent last 4 decades of housing construction, where I have scaled these charts to be roughly the same in terms of the heights of the bars, almost the entire decade of the 1990s, we were constructing housing at the same pace as we did at the depths of the Great Depression. So we have really not been providing new housing at nearly the same pace in the last 40 years, or even just the last few years, if you want to go back only just a couple years, as we did a century ago. So 1934 is a big year for housing in the United States. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president in 1932. He's pushing the New Deal. We have on the upper left-hand side, stop me if this looks familiar, Samantha, but we see a lot of homeless encampments across the city, across the region. We were seeing that 100 years ago. They were known as Hoovervilles and considered to be sort of the result of President Herbert Hoover's terrible policies, and that resulted in Franklin Delano Roosevelt being elected into office. And so with the New Deal, one of the most important things that the New Deal did was creating the National Housing Act, which created the Federal Housing Administration. This was the first time ever that the federal government was taking such an active, proactive role in housing policy, which was so often seen as a local issue, not a federal issue. Until the creation of the Federal Housing Act, Federal Housing Administration under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, if you wanted to purchase a home, you certainly could, but it would have to be entirely through private lending from private banks. So it was pretty difficult to get more than like a 10 or 15-year mortgage. So home ownership was pretty limited in terms of the opportunities for folks to purchase homes in the country, because it was just so expensive, and you really had to be able to have enough money to cover a great deal more of the housing expenses than you would once the Federal Housing Administration came around and created what now is a fixture of home ownership, the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. The 30-year fixed rate mortgage is something that was created as part of this National Housing Act in order to allow folks to spread out housing payments over a much longer period of time. You think about it, if you can spread out your payments over 30 years instead of 10, you can dramatically make it more affordable to purchase a home. And that is the legacy, if nothing else, of the National Housing Act of 1934. But in order to mitigate against risk, the Federal Housing Administration created a Federal Home Loan Bank Board, which then empowered a group called the Homeowners Loan Corporation to determine risk, to figure out, okay, if we're going to be giving people 30-year mortgages, how do we make sure that we're really minimizing the risk associated with those 30-year mortgages? Well, the Homeowners Loan Corporation created maps that looked like this. This is a redlining map for central Los Angeles. They did this across the entire country, identifying areas with color-coded maps that were color-coded green, blue, yellow, and red. An area color-coded green, no problem getting a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage financed and supported by the federal government. Area color-coded blue, still pretty good. You're not going to have much difficulty getting a mortgage with the federal backing available to make a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage possible. Area color-coded yellow, near impossible. Not totally impossible, but pretty close to it. And areas color-coded red, 100% impossible. You could not get an area that was redlined. No bank would touch providing a mortgage here with the backing of the federal government, because the federal government would simply just walk away. They were never going to support people purchasing homes in areas that were redlined. So this is the redlining map for central Los Angeles that was created in the mid-1930s. So the question becomes, well, how did they determine? How did they determine an area was green versus what an area was red? So here's a couple areas I've circled here, just a mile or two apart from each other in Hollywood. The one circled in green, directly adjacent to Runyon Canyon, and the area circled in red, more central Hollywood, around some of the studios. So what was the description that they offered, the Homeowners Loan Corporation offered for these two areas? For the area outlined in green, they described it as having a moderately increasing population with business and professional men, executives, capitalists, motion picture stars with annual incomes of $3,600 a year and upward. No foreign families, no nationalities, no Negroes, and no apparent or anticipated shifting or infiltration. This is the top line, Samantha. This is the top line of a single page description that determined that this area was color coded green. The bottom lines on this same page went on to say, provisions protect against subversive racial hazards. So we're clear, that's key, because what they're identifying here in terms of what might be a risk associated with providing a 30-year mortgage in this community is that there are provisions in place that will ensure that for a significant period of time going forward, that there will not be what they describe as subversive racial hazards. And if you or anyone that you talk to about any of this stuff will be wondering, well, what the heck is a subversive racial hazard? That's a pretty significant way to frame something. Well, let's look at the area that they color-coded red, with a redlined. They describe that area as having a slightly increasing population with white-collar workers, movie and radio employees, doesn't seem terrible here, service workers, artisans with annual incomes of $1,200 to $2,000 a year, 15% foreign families, Orientals and Mexicans with a few percent Negroes, and then they say infiltration of Orientals is increasing. And they go on to say down toward the bottom here, the last couple lines in this description, these documents are all available publicly now. But you'll see in the bottom few lines, they say, were it not for a scattering of Japanese and Filipino residents, this section would be entitled to a higher grade. The area as a whole is assigned a medial red grade. Were it not for a scattering of Japanese and Filipino residents, I just think that that's really remarkable and important to note, because they earlier on this say that the maintenance is generally poor quality, population is extremely heterogeneous and includes many subversive racial and social elements. So they're saying, if the handful of folks here who are Japanese or Filipino weren't there, this would at least be a yellow, right? Like this area would be afforded a higher grade, and maybe you could actually get a mortgage, a 30-year mortgage in this community. But nope, can't do it because there's a handful of folks who are Japanese or Filipino who live in this community, and thus it is a subversive racial element that makes this community not worth the federal government providing their backing for people who want to purchase homes here. So that's in the 1930s. In 1939, there's a young woman named Hattie McDaniel. I don't know if she was too young. She was probably in her middle ages. She wins the Oscar for Gone with the Wind. And there's a tweet here that someone put up the other day that I thought was worth noting in light of everything that happened at the last Oscars this year, where he says that the year that she won the Oscar for Gone with the Wind, people had to pull favors to let her in the building. And she was made to sit at the far end of the room against the wall with her agent. So Hattie McDaniel, 1939, is the first black winner of an Oscar. And she's almost not even allowed into the building for accepting her Oscar award. Well, she purchased a home in a community called Sugar Hill. And Sugar Hill was an area that's all mansions. They were all white homeowners, and she was able to purchase a home in this community, presumably by offering more than enough money for the white homeowners to resell to her and ignore the existing covenant that was on the home that said, no, you can't resell this home to someone who's not white. And subsequently, a number of other entertainers, black entertainers, actors in the industry started purchasing others of these homes in Sugar Hill, and the neighbors, the white neighbors, took them to court. And it was the very first decision that would ever come down against the housing covenants was as a result of her purchasing her home and others of her colleagues, other black entertainers and actors purchasing homes in Sugar Hill and then being challenged by the white homeowners who wanted to enforce the existing housing covenants and deed restrictions. That in 1945 was the very first time a judge ever ruled against these covenants. And only 3 years later, in 1948, in Shelley v. Kramer, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed with that position. They refused to, they held that these housing covenants were unenforceable in the courts of law. However, important caveats to that. First, their decision was 6-0. And yes, there were 9 justices in the Supreme Court, but 3 of them lived in homes with these covenants. And so they recuse themselves because they would be seen as biased. The second thing to note is that as the subheading of the header to the headline to the right says, they refuse to declare these restrictions invalid, which is to say, you can't enforce it in the courts, but they're not illegal. And so how do they get enforced for years to come? Through other means, extrajudicial, let's call them. We start to see violence. We start to see people being threatened. And there are plenty of stories of that occurring throughout LA and elsewhere. So in the 1940s, even if the federal government had invested all this money through the National Housing Act and the Federal Housing Administration providing these federally backed mortgages, housing is still expensive for a lot of people. So what does the federal government do? A new part of the New Deal is to actually start constructing federally funded public housing. Start doing that in the late 30s, and it really takes off in the 1940s. We might call it public housing, right? I might call it, that's what it is. And we start to see thousands and thousands of new public housing getting constructed all across the country. And this is a big deal. This is a big deal. However, that housing, is actually segregated. It is intentionally segregated. So there are white public housing developments and black public housing developments. And ne'er the twain shall meet. They're intentionally segregated for decades. So even though the federal government is stepping in and, providing folks with housing that they can afford to live in, it is still separating that housing on the basis of race. And in California, we went so far as to put the California Realty Board put a ballot measure before the voters in 1950 that the voters overwhelmingly approved, 2-1, that amended our state constitution by adding what is now known as Article 34, which requires that for the construction of publicly funded housing, you need a vote of the voters in the city where that housing will be constructed. And that is still the law of the land. So, here in Los Angeles, we actually are getting pretty close to the limit on how much publicly funded housing can be built from the last time we voted to allow more to get built. So there's probably going to have to be another ballot measure, which is a whole expensive campaign to get people to agree to allow more publicly funded housing to get built, because this is still the law of the land. And while there have been attempts to put a repeal of this constitutional provision on the ballot, they have so far not succeeded in the last few years to get it on the ballot, but it looks like it probably will be in 2024. However, there have been 3 previous attempts to remove this provision from our Constitution, and all 3 have failed. It requires a vote of the entire state of California. It requires another ballot measure to remove Article 34 from our Constitution, and that has so far not yet occurred. And because that is in our Constitution still, that adds somewhere from $5,000 to $20,000 of additional costs to every single publicly financed housing unit that gets built in the state today. So even though this is something from 70-ish years ago, it continues to be an enormous burden on our ability to construct affordable housing here in the state of California. So we passed that in 1950, and that essentially for a good period of time halted the construction of publicly funded housing. And then subsequent to that, we have this era that I'm roughly ascribing to this term white flight, where we start to see white folks sort of leaving big cities like Los Angeles, Long Beach, and going into these newly incorporated communities. In LA County, where we have 10 million residents, we have 88 cities. And of those 88 cities, nearly 35 of them, so more than a third, incorporated in a single decade from the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s. And the primary reason for the incorporation of all these much smaller cities popping up all over LA County was local control. Local control. It was about residents wanting to have their own say in who could and could not live in a community, as the explicit allowance of racial discrimination in housing was falling by the wayside and the implicit was still only holding on by a thread, folks started exerting local control. And what did this look like? Well, today we see all of these communities and think that maybe it'd be very easy to think they've been there all along, but they haven't. And in the example of a particular city, the city of Lakewood, which is in southeast LA County, according to a book by the name of The Color of Law, written by a guy named Richard Rothstein, who's a professor at UC Berkeley, he says that builders went to the Federal Housing Administration and submitted plans for development to create the community of Lakewood. It was a 17,000 single-family home community. And the Federal Housing Administration said that those plans had to include a commitment never to sell a home to an African American, and a commitment that each of those homes have a clause in every deed prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. In other words, the federal government in the late 1940s, early 1950s was saying, you want to build these large subdivisions of new single-family homes with our support? Sure, but only if you racially discriminate on the basis of race to exclude people who are black from living in these communities. And that was how Lakewood, the creation of the city of Lakewood, was funded and existed for many, many years. Another thing so that was a key part of what enabled white flight, was the federal government stepping in and provided financing for the construction of these new single-family communities that were popping up all across the country, and especially here in LA County. Another thing that really enabled this era of white flight was our rapidly expanding freeway network, which I'll show in just a moment, and then also contract cities. So where previously in the 1950s, if a city wanted to incorporate as its own, they had to stand up their own police department, their own fire department, their own library system, their own schools, etc. Lakewood, actually, again, it was the case with Lakewood, where they said, no, we're just going to contract. We're going to collect the tax dollars from our homeowners, but we're going to contract with sheriff, county sheriff, we're going to contract with county fire, we're going to contract with whomever, at a larger level, and we're going to we'll do those contracts so they can provide these services for us locally. That model went to court, was challenged in the courts, and they ultimately won. And once they won, a number of other cities started incorporating under the same model, where they would contract with county services in order to provide the local services that they didn't want to stand up themselves. So I mentioned our freeway network. It'd be easy to think today when you're driving down the freeway that it's been there forever. Not true. The freeways that we have today mostly were constructed from the 1950s onward, and they involved the displacement of tens of thousands of people in order to construct freeways across the county. And as we'll see in a little bit, that was not where the freeways are located, and where they're routed was not just sort of some coincidence where they went. And case in point, this is the Temp Freeway at Western Avenue. And you may think, well, that's a really odd picture to sort of throw into the presentation here. And yes, it is. However, this is Sugar Hill today. So I mentioned Sugar Hill, which was the community that was this blossoming, growing community of black entertainers and actors buying these mansions that successfully challenged in the courts to allow more wealthy black folks to purchase these mansions in this very notable community in LA. Well, when our transportation planners had decisions to make about where to route this 12-lane freeway, they ended up opting for going straight through the heart of Sugar Hill. And while some of the mansions that were purchased back in the 30s and 40s by those black folks do still exist today, many of them were demolished in order to construct a freeway right through the center of that neighborhood. So you might be thinking, Samantha, well, aren't there some people who want to stop discrimination on the basis of race in housing? And the answer is yes. And here in California, we passed a law in 1963 called the Rumford Act, the Rumford Fair Housing Act, which barred discrimination in rental accommodations in buildings of 5 or more units. So small to medium to large apartment buildings, you could no longer discriminate on the basis of race in making and housing accommodations for those buildings. The law originally, when it was first proposed, was intended to apply to all housing, but it wasn't going to be able to get passed by the state legislature here in California with it applying to everything. So they restricted it to only applying to buildings with 5 or more units. And subsequently, 1 year later, California voters took up Proposition 14, which was placed on the ballot to repeal the Rumford Act. There's a brochure on the left-hand side which talks about why we should vote yes on Prop 14, which says it will restore to California property owners the right to choose the person or persons to whom they wish to sell or rent their residential property. It should be noted here that brochure never once talks about race, but that's entirely what this is about, because there was never an issue with the landlord being able to choose the person or persons to whom they wish to sell or rent their residential property on any other reason other than race. All that Prop 14 would do was overturn the Rumford Act. And indeed, Prop 14 won 65% in favor, 35 opposed. And here in LA County, 70% voted in support of Prop 14 to once again allow discrimination on the basis of race in housing with 5 or more units. So one example of sort of how this played out locally and that I tie to this, because I think it's important to see how technical elements of our zoning code connect to the era in which they were adopted. Dingbats are what I call LA's quintessential affordable housing. You've seen them. If you've been anywhere in central LA, around anywhere where there's apartment buildings, you have seen what we call here dingbats, which are typically 5, 7, 9, 10, 12 unit buildings, 2 or 3, sometimes 4 stories, where there's parking located underneath, where it maybe dips down a little bit, or maybe it's at street level, and the building's up on stilts, and there's units that go up a couple floors from that. So these really took off in the 1950s, which was a time when we actually pushed up our parking minimums just slightly to 1.25 spaces per unit. And so what that meant for the construction of dingbats, which were largely replacing single-family homes in our dense urban communities, or dense central communities in LA, that meant that architects would work backward. So I look at a piece of property and they go, okay, how many parking spaces can I fit on this property? That will determine how many apartments I can put on this property. And now the reason I bring this up in this particular moment, because we just had this thing about the Rumford Act and Prop 14. Prop 14 was approved in 1964. Prop 14 was intended to once again allow discrimination on the basis of race in buildings with 5 or more units. Well, where were we seeing a lot of construction of buildings of 5 or more units? Dingbats. Dingbats, which had been getting a lot of construction. It would take 6 to 9 to maybe 12 months to construct a new dingbat on a piece of land, and we were seeing hundreds of these going up across central Los Angeles. So the same year that LA voted 70% in favor of once again allowing discrimination on the basis of race in these buildings that were propagating all across the city, in 1964, we also increased the parking minimums for these buildings just a little more, up to 1.5 spaces per unit. But except now, when architects would work backward from the amount of space on a piece of land to figure out how many units could fit, it no longer penciled. It no longer worked out that it was affordable, or that someone could afford a single family homeowner could go into and say, okay, I want to convert, I bought this home, but I want to make it into an apartment building. They could no longer do that. And so we saw the end of the mass production of dingbat apartments by 1965 as a result of just one little tweak, make it just a little bit harder to build these buildings, at the same time that these were some of the only buildings where folks who were not white could live in some of our central LA communities. So we did finally see the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. And this was the first time the federal government said, you cannot discriminate on the basis of race for the accommodation of housing. What is significant about this particular bill is that it was described as the most filibustered bill in the history of the U.S. Senate. So this is to say, housing is a bit of a electrified third rail, as you might say. It is a bit of a hot topic, not just locally, but nationally. And what's also significant about this bill is it was, as the most filibustered bill in the history of the U.S. Senate, it had languished in the Senate for years. And it was only upon the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 that 1 week later the U.S. Senate finally voted to send this bill to the desk of President Lyndon Johnson. It was only upon the assassination of the leader of the civil rights movement that they were finally shamed into stopping filibustering this bill and allowing it to proceed to be signed by the president. And this bill, for what it is, which with disallowing discrimination on the basis of race and the accommodation of housing, it also didn't do anything else. So as we've seen, decades and decades of very explicitly racial discrimination in the accommodation of housing that allowed for millions of white Americans to purchase, resell homes, earn money on investments in homes. That does not change what had taken place all the way up until this point with this passage of the Fair Housing Act. It just now says, okay, now you can't discriminate on the basis of race anymore in the accommodation of housing. And in fact, in 1968, nearly 90% of all of the Federal Housing Administration's mortgages, those 30-year fixed-rate mortgages, had gone to upper class income neighborhoods. Only 11% had gone to lower and middle class neighborhoods. So it's no longer legal to discriminate on the basis of race in housing. We have a governor here in the state of California who was a strong proponent of the Proposition 14 to once again allow discrimination on the basis of race in housing a couple of years prior, who's also signs into law this California Environmental Quality Act, which when it was first signed into law was intended to apply strictly to big, large public works projects, but very quickly applied to every single thing that was proposed to be done anywhere in the state. Building a home, repaving a street, you name it. Within just a couple years, CEQA has applied to everything. And this is also an era which I described previously with that orange bar in the timeline of constriction. And in fact, City of LA was updating a lot of its community plans. And at the time, LA City Council President John Gibson, 1973, has this quote that I thought was really kind of hitting the nail on the head, which is, what you're doing exactly, and I think you know it, is instead of giving people a chance to move around the city and be able to buy a single residential lot, you've decided the house has to be on a larger lot and is therefore more expensive. You have made it impossible to do anything but just make the ghetto larger. That's exactly what you've done. What he's referring to here is minimum lot size, and that in the wealthier West Side neighborhoods, the city was proposing to increase and ultimately approved increases in the minimum lot size. And all that would do, as he's pointing out, is make it impossible for folks with somewhat lesser means to be able to purchase a home on these other properties. Because as I said earlier, single-family zoning was just whatever the size of the piece of land, you can only build one house. So now some of these communities are incentivized to make the land even to combine parcels next to each other, to find ways to make it even harder and harder and harder to allow people to live in these communities. For a number of years, Samantha, we had a president who talked about building a wall to keep people out. This is essentially what we've done with our zoning here in LA and elsewhere, is we've constructed a wall of zoning codes and laws, which makes it impossible to build more housing in the communities where people most want to live. So 1973 is another thing. We stopped constructing federally funded public housing. So public housing was explicitly segregated on the basis of race up until the 1960s. I'm going to assume, although I don't know this for fact, but I'm going to assume up until the Fair Housing Act, which finally said you can no longer discriminate on the basis of race in the accommodation of housing. And just a few years later, well, we decided we're done with that. We had, President Nixon was president at the time. We're done with the federal government stepping in and supporting the construction of public housing. We also have this era of urban renewal, which is a term that people should know if they're going to be involved in housing policy, because it's a pretty stark era. These are some photos of a community in Los Angeles that no longer exists. It is Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill from the 30s and 40s here being depicted in these photos. Bunker Hill was redlined because it was so racially heterogeneous, so racially mixed, so ethnically mixed. It was considered a very, very unwise investment. And so therefore, there was no investment in Bunker Hill for many, many years. And homes were, they started falling apart. They were derelict because there was no investment happening. There was no support for folks to purchase homes in these communities, in this community in particular. And so what happened to Bunker Hill? We did this. We literally flattened the hill. It is still a hill, but not as much of a hill as it was. And the two homes you see in the lower right-hand picture were actually shipped off to a little outdoor museum of some old homes that's up in the East LA. I'm forgetting the name of it off the top of my head right now, but yeah. So this is what we did with urban renewal, and there are many cities across the country that did this, where the federal government would step in and say, "We'll provide you with a lot of resources, so you can basically clear what they called slum clearance." Communities that had been redlined, where then they would build these, large public works facilities. In this case, Dorothy Chandler Music Pavilion, the LA County Hall of Administration, LA Department of Public Works, etc. It was not until 1977 with the Community Reinvestment Act at the federal level that we finally officially put an end to redlining. And then just 1 year later, here in the state of California, we approved Proposition 13. I think it's important to recognize Proposition 13 not just for what it means today in terms of the imbalance that it creates, where longtime homeowners are paying pennies in the dollar what newer homeowners are paying to live in California, but also the era in which it was approved, which was a time where we were still seeing racial grievance at a very significant level here in California, just a decade removed from a 2-to-1 vote in support of continuing to on the basis of race and the accommodation of housing, where it was just 10 years from the passage of the Fair Housing Act, where for generations, only white folks had access to even purchasing a home anywhere in the state of California. And it had only been a decade since that was no longer allowed on a legal basis, that we then bake in this financial advantage for existing homeowners. It was not sold as a thing for white folks to advantage them over black and brown folks, but it might as well have been, because that is what it did. And then here in the city of LA, a decade after that, in 1986, we passed Proposition U. And I note this one because it's a really significant part of our local history. It's still the law of the land. It was put on the ballot by City Council member Zev Yaroslavsky, who's shown there in the lower left-hand corner. And it was in reaction to the construction of a few different buildings that we saw in different parts of LA, the West Side Pavilion on the upper left-hand side there, the Fujita building in Encino in the center part, and the Beverly Center on the upper right-hand side, where folks were freaking out about overdevelopment. Things are getting too big. There's going to be too much traffic, too much parking. And what Proposition U did was downzone every single corridor, every single major corridor in the city. So where we used to allow what they call a floor area ratio of 3-to-1, which is for every 100 square feet, you can build 300 square feet of a use. We only allow now 1.5-to-1. So for every 100 square feet of land, you can only provide 150 square feet of a use. So that single passage of that one ballot measure wiped off the map the space for about 1 million apartments. It's just very back of the napkin kind of calculation on my part, but it was a hugely significant measure in downzoning the city of Los Angeles. So what did that look like in terms of constriction, that era that I identified from roughly from the 60s to the 80s? In 1960, the city of Los Angeles had zoned capacity for 10 million residents. In other words, if we had built out everything as maximally as we could across the whole city, we could have had 10 million people living in the city of LA. And now, we have a little over 4 million. You might think 10 million, that just seems huge. That would be about the density of the city of San Francisco. So that puts that a little bit in perspective, which city of San Francisco is not, believe it or not, the most densely populated city in the country, let alone on the planet for sure. But 10 million, we had the zone capacity for that, and we engaged in a significant campaign of downzoning over the next couple decades, to get down to a zone capacity of just south of 4 million by 1980. And we've had only slight upticks since then, which also means that the areas, the opportunities for providing more housing are very, very limited, very, very restricted, and makes them that much more expensive. When you really restrict the opportunity and access to something, it makes it more expensive. So we've done a very good job about that here in Los Angeles. And it wasn't until the passage of Measure JJJ in 2016 that was the first time in our city's history that we voted to create more housing, to support the construction of more housing across the city of Los Angeles. Now, this is just a City of LA measure. This does not exist for the other 87 cities or unincorporated LA County areas of LA County. So this only applies to the city of 4 million residents out of a county of 10 million and a region of 18 million. But it's still significant because this one measure has been the largest success in the construction and the creation of new affordable housing across the city of LA. I'm going to say that one more time. This one measure has been the biggest success in the creation of new designated affordable housing across the city of Los Angeles, because what this measure does with the creation of the transit-oriented communities program that came out of Measure JJJ is it strongly incentivizes new housing construction developers to provide low-income, designated low-income, very low-income, extremely low-income housing to receive bonuses of additional height or density, reductions in setbacks, reduced parking requirements, you name it. And they're happy to do that, it turns out, in many cases, because this allows them to reduce the time to go from proposal to construction and create more certainty in a project getting approved, which is one of the biggest risks for developers of larger multi-unit housing construction across the city. So I'm going to show another video here about how our laws play out. Here we go.
Their admissions decisions might be rescinded because rich white homeowners don't want them to have the opportunity to go to one of the best public universities in the world. This man, Phil Bokovoy, leads a group called Save Berkeley's Neighborhoods. SBN is suing the school to cap attendance under the California Environmental Quality Act. The California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, is a Reagan-era regulation that maintains the status quo and benefits only boomers like Phil. The house he owns in Berkeley is worth nearly $1.5 million, and because of Prop 13, he has subsidized nearly $10,000 a year on his property taxes. He's also a Berkeley alum with a master's in economics and a JD from UC Berkeley, but I guess he doesn't want anyone else to have that opportunity. I myself am an alum. I want everybody who wants to go to Berkeley to have the opportunity to go to Berkeley. So not only is he being a boomer NIMBY, he's also being a racist. He had the audacity to suggest that enrolling students at the same rate would turn Berkeley into Bangkok, Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, dense Asian cities where there's no transportation network, which not only rings of anti-Asian racism, giving the high rate of Asian enrollment at UC Berkeley, and also demonizes Southeast Asia. It's not an accurate picture of what those transit networks look like in those cities. In fact, Bangkok and Kuala Lumpur are much more sustainable while having higher population densities and higher populations. Not to mention that as an alum, I remember, and as a resident, he should know, there are 3 BART stops in Berkeley, as well as a robust bus network, and it's very walkable. So what can we do to stop this man from preventing 3,000 students from going to their dream school? First, if you live in California, email your state senator and assembly person. Second, sign this petition here. Link will also be in the comments. Third, share this video with someone you care about. Share it with somebody who went to Cal. Share it with somebody who wants to go to Cal. Share it with anybody who plans to go to UCs, because you know what? The other UCs are watching this. La Jolla, Westwood, they want this to go through. They want housing to be prevented so that people can't go to UCLA, they can't go to UCSD, and they take back these college towns from universities that have been there forever. I will love my school until the day I die, and I will fight for everybody's opportunity to go to that school. So send an email, share this video, sign the petition, and go Bears.
So I think mostly I'm distracted by the cat that she has behind her. But while I jest, I actually, when we saw the when we saw the action that was taken there, where the courts upheld the CEQA restriction on allowing more students to go to UC Berkeley, immediately we started seeing grumblings of doing the same thing in Westwood with UCLA. We saw something with UC Irvine. So, you know, this is all part of a larger system that is designed to make it harder and harder and harder for folks to have access to services and housing, and in a way then continuing to sort of perpetuate, not sort of, but continuing to perpetuate decades and decades of discrimination on the basis of race compounded on each other. So how does this play out? You know, we'll look at how some of these things play out today. For starters, a lot of folks think that, oh, we're building so much housing today. We're building so much housing. No, we're not. That's just the answer to that is no, we're not. We are building a decent amount of housing. No problem with us building a decent amount of housing. We are not building so much housing. The reality is that we are building housing at a rate today, which is the lowest it's ever been, and has been that way for the last 3 decades, significantly lower than any preceding decade going back over the last century. There's no reason for that other than we have made it so impossibly difficult to do it. Going back to that chart with the line going straight down from a housing capacity of 10 million residents down to 4, this is the direct result of that work. The direct result of making it that much harder to build housing is we're just not building as much housing. And if we look at that redlining map again and overlay something that I mentioned previously, you'll see a pattern, I think, emerge pretty quickly. This is our freeway network here in Los Angeles today. Our freeways were intentionally constructed through areas that had been redlined. That is the long and short of it. And in fact, in some places, they were constructed to separate communities that were redlined from communities that were green and blue lined, like you can see over on the west side with the 405. This was done by design. This is not unintentional. Freeways were seen as a way to do quote unquote slum clearance. If you could just, you know, drive a freeway through it, it would remove the issue. And for those folks who lived in these communities, like Boyle Heights was a very racially mixed community in the 30s and 40s. It was known as a very largely Jewish community, actually. We built 6 freeways through Boyle Heights. And Boyle Heights, you think about folks who would be displaced by that. If you were a white person displaced by freeway construction, you could probably buy a home in another community with not a lot of difficulty, because as a white person, a white household, that would be available to you. But if you were a black or brown person being displaced by the construction of a freeway, not a lot of options. Not a lot of options. The blue stars here indicate the area, the communities where we have public housing, where federally funded public housing was constructed in the 1940s before we made it dang near impossible with Article 34's passage onto our Constitution in 1950. Almost all of the public housing that we did construct in that decade was built in areas that were redlined. How else redlining plays out today? Our formerly redlined communities, they're hotter than our formerly green and blue line communities today. This past few days, where our temperatures have been up in the mid 90s, our formerly redlined communities have been 7 to 8 degrees hotter than our formerly green and blue lined communities. Our formerly redlined communities are more dangerous for people to walk and bike and take transit or drive. In no small part because we made the streets faster and wider so that the white folks who were trying to get to their green and blue line communities could get to them more easily. And we also found more opposition to making streets faster and wider in the exclusively white communities because they didn't want the streets to be bigger or wider in their communities. Parks. Our parks in our formerly redlined communities are half as large and 5 times as crowded. Policing. Sorry, I just it's one thing after another, but policing. A study of race and policing done a couple years ago found differences between black and white neighborhoods, where they found that our black communities are over-policed when it comes to social control and under-policed when it comes to emergency services. This study also found that policing both responds to and reinforces segregated landscapes. Home appraisals, just a year ago, found that homes in Black and Latino neighborhoods are undervalued to the tune of 23%. 23%. Take the same home in a majority white neighborhood and put it in a majority Black neighborhood in 2020, and it will lose 23% of its value. This is what I mean when I talk about our housing policies are systemically racist today. And that is how you know that, because the only way this can be explained is race. And that gap between homes that in majority white communities and homes in majority Black communities is bigger today than it was 40 years ago. So rather than getting better, it's actually getting worse. Urban canopy. Whiter and wealthier neighborhoods, formerly green and blue line communities, have 50% more greenery and urban canopy compared with formerly red and yellow line communities. There's been a fair amount of new research in this area in the last couple of years, which is finding this is just remarkable, that policies that existed 80, 90 years ago have persisted for so long in their effects to this day. Air pollution. A study that just came out last month found that there's a strong correlation between pollution levels today and historical patterns of redlining from 80 years ago. That areas that were former redline communities have significantly higher levels of air pollution. And indeed, we see that play out with COVID. This is a map from, at this point now, it's 8 or 9 months ago. But the data is no different today than it was then, which is that the communities that have the worst air quality, which on this map are indicated with the redder colors, the areas, the greener colors have much better air quality. These are two maps overlaid on one another, but the communities with the worst air quality have much higher rates of COVID, directly linked to each other, linked to our redlining maps of almost a century ago. So LA is the 6th most segregated of 221 metro areas. This is not a record to be proud of. And we are just about as segregated today as we were 30 years ago, and more segregated than cities like Cleveland or Philadelphia. In our city, 45% of our white households own their home compared to 20% of our Black households. And across the country, Black homeownership today is about the same as it was 50 years ago. And the gap between Black and white homeownership is larger now than any time in the last 30 years. Again, 30 years of almost a very little housing construction. And I think not coincidentally, we're seeing housing prices skyrocketing and making it harder and harder for folks who didn't already have generations of wealth developed as a result of explicitly and then implicitly racist housing policies to support them in purchasing homes or moving their way out in terms of homes being left out. This is a map which is from the 2010 census. It's not a lot different for the 2020 census, but every dot on this map is a person counted in the 2010 census and approximately where they're located. The blue dots are white people, the green dots are Black people, the red dots are what the census designates as Asian, and the orange dots are what the census designates as Hispanic. And you'll notice that where the blue dots are located, the dots are spread further out. And where the orange dots are located, they're really, really closely to, they're almost like solid orange areas. That is literally an indication of housing density in LA. And that shows that most of the single family home communities are almost exclusively white in LA in 2010. Now we do see some green areas. That includes like Ladera Heights and Crenshaw and Inglewood, which are they're actually exceptions to the rule about home ownership and single family home communities, which are actually, in this case, historically Black home ownership communities and have been for several generations, which is, I think, excellent that exists. Unfortunately, it is the exception to the rule. So in terms of construction, I provide this quote here from a report done by the California Legislative Analyst a couple years ago, where they concluded, I guess not too shockingly, that building less housing than people demand drives high housing costs. They're saying if you're not building enough housing, housing prices go up. And we can see, if you look at these two charts next to each other, on the left is for the city of LA, where, and this is something that happened across the state, not just in LA, but certainly in LA we did this pretty successfully, where we downzoned, reduced our zone capacity by more than half, a reduction, 60% reduction. And then on the right is housing prices in California and housing prices in the United States. And in California, housing prices have generally been higher than the U.S. for about a century. I mean, it's an area that has been more desirable relative to the average across the country. But what we see, even though they're higher in 1940, 1950, 1960, is they decouple from the prices across the rest of the country starting in the 1980s, which is after the end of decades of really significant downzoning. Our housing prices start to completely decouple from housing prices across the rest of the country, to the point where from 2010 to 2015, where the rest of the country saw a decline in housing prices, California continued to see an increase in housing prices. Now, you might notice from the 1990 to 2000, there's a drop in California where the rest of the country goes up. We were already so exorbitantly high, which was a result of a number of different factors in the late 1980s, early 1990s. That era that I also showed, where we did not construct very much housing for many years in the 1990s, we were having a significant depression era here recession here in California. So it's not particularly shocking that we weren't building very much housing at that time, and we saw our housing prices come down, but subsequently they've just continued to skyrocket. And then this chart, which I think is probably one of the most instructive of any in this entire presentation. And what this shows is the 30 largest metropolitan areas in the country. Large metropolitan area, it's on this map, from Denver to Portland to Houston to Sacramento to Cleveland to Dallas to New York to Salt Lake City, Miami, Los Angeles. They're all on this map, all on this chart. There are two data points on this chart. The data along the bottom, from left to right, is the ratio of adult age population to homes. So if you have two people in a neighborhood and one home, your ratio is 2 to 1 or 2, right? So that where it says 2, a little bit to the left of center, that's where the dot would be located on that vertical bar. And the numbers, the percentages on the left, are the median housing costs as a percent of the median earnings. So in other words, if the median earning in a neighborhood is $20,000 and the median housing cost annually is $10,000, then it would be 50%. 10,000 of 20,000 is 50%. So literally that's all they're looking at here, is how many people for how many homes, and what's the cost of housing relative to the amount of income that people generally earn in that area. LA is all the way to the right. You'll see LA all the way to the right. We have, of the 30 largest metropolitan areas, our area of 18 million residents. It's not just city of LA, not just even LA County, but includes portions of Orange County, San Bernardino, Riverside, Ventura. Our metropolitan statistical area, we have the fewest homes for the number of people living in our area. I'm going to say that again. We have the fewest of the 30 largest metropolitan areas. We do the worst, far and away, worse than anyone else in terms of the number of homes we have for the number of people living here today, right now. We also have the highest cost of housing relative to the income, the average income in our area as well. Far and away. I mean, San Diego comes close to us. You can see them to the left of LA, but that's it. No one comes even close to that. We hear about how expensive it is in San Francisco or how expensive in New York. They do better than Los Angeles in terms of the median area housing costs as a percent of median area earnings. And in fact, if we wanted for LA to be closer to like Portland or Dallas or Houston, I've drawn a little arrow here to look at, if we were to try and get our housing costs, so instead of being almost 60% of our average earnings, that they would be down to about 40% of our average earnings. To get our number of homes, we'd have to build enough homes so that we had one home for every 2 people instead of one home for every 2.35 people. We'd have to build 1.2 million homes today. So when we talk about housing and having not and our housing crisis, a lot of times folks talk about new people coming to LA, right? The issue is we don't have enough housing for the people who are here today. We don't have enough housing for the people who are already living in LA right now. And frankly, I don't give two flips about the people who want to come here. To me, this is the heart of our challenge. Is we continue to think about housing as though we're trying to provide it for people who are still to come here? No. We do a terrible job providing housing for the people who are here right now. We have the most overcrowded housing anywhere of the 30 largest metropolitan areas. That's on us. That's on us to fix for ourselves. So I know the California Environmental Quality Act, I said it was signed into law by Governor Reagan in 1970. It has been used largely to fight infill housing overwhelmingly, and overwhelmingly by groups that have no record in terms of environmental advocacy. It's been quite successful in halting the construction of housing or making it much more difficult to build housing, taking a lot longer. Housing projects requiring an environmental impact report take 2.5 years to approve. So our environmental act is making housing a lot more difficult to build. And in this era over the last 20 years, we've built 1 million more homes in high fire danger areas, which CEQA has been fairly quiet on. CEQA has for decades incentivized building housing on the urban fringes rather than in our city centers. That's starting to change finally, but very slowly and only very recently. So we've had decades and decades of our environmental law saying build further and further out, closer and closer to areas with high wildfire danger. And in terms of homelessness, which I think is a reason a lot of us come to this conversation, it's important to note a couple things that I think if we're going to have a frank conversation about homelessness, we have to acknowledge. Firstly is that most of the people who are homeless in LA County, they've been here for a long time. They had homes. They lived in apartments. This is not an issue where it's all these people coming from outside LA to come live in LA County. This is people who've lived in LA County in many cases, for the vast majority of them, for more than a decade. And then we hear about folks who are mentally ill or have substance abuse issues. It is true that there are folks living on our streets who have mental illness and substance abuse issues. It is true. But 7 out of 10 have neither. And in fact, the number of people living on our streets with substance abuse or mental health issues is not that much higher than in our housed population. But it just so happens, I would say, that not having a roof over your head is pretty difficult to get over when it comes to trying to get through a mental health or substance abuse issue. And then this last bullet point here, which to me is another example, another touch point in demonstrating that this is a systemically racist housing policy, is that 8% of LA County's population is Black, but 33% of our homeless population are Black. And there is no other explanation for this besides racism. None whatsoever. And why homelessness at the rates that we do, a study by the Harvard University Joint Center for Housing Studies looked at this and found very clearly that there was a connection between housing unaffordability and the number of people experiencing homelessness. That the more expensive housing is, the more people who are homeless in your community. And a pretty strong correlation that they identified with that. So not particularly rocket science, but for some folks it really is. I mentioned at the start about institutional power, and this is something I think is important to acknowledge in this conversation at this moment here, which is Dorothy Walker, who's the founder of the American Planning Association, planners who have a big say on what can be built where, in terms of what can be built where, wrote an op-ed a couple years ago where she pointed out that the very people who support progressive change elsewhere use local control of land use to prevent structural changes in their communities that would advance the cause of racial justice. And that as long as the people who own land and are already housed have total control over growth and change in their communities, we will never achieve true racial justice and social equity. She's calling out the folks here who had on one side of the home the Black Lives Matter flag, and on the other side of the home, don't allow these apartments buildings to get built in our neighborhood, right? We see this all across our communities, across the country. It's not just limited to Los Angeles. We see this everywhere where folks say, I want to advance racial justice. I want to advance opportunities for everyone, but not that way. Don't do that. Don't block my view, don't block my son, don't create more traffic or more parking issues or blah, blah, blah. You fill in the blank, you name it. That she's saying you can't have both. You can't say you care about racial justice and then make it impossible for people to live in your community. And then, I point this out because a lot of times we hear about, greedy developers. This is actually something that was an analysis done up in Portland, or in Oregon, I should say, a couple months ago, which looked at who earned more money, developers or homeowners. And on this chart, they are showing the developer earnings. You can just barely see them. They're little tiny dark blue lines. The big lighter blue lines, that's homeowner equity gains every single year. And I know myself as a homeowner that my husband and I, who are two working professionals in white collar jobs, are earning less money every year combined than our home earns in equity. And there is no way to work our way out of this. We have to build more housing in order to make housing more affordable. I just want to sort of tie up this part around single family versus multifamily housing to show something here, which I think is really meaningful and significant. So this is City of LA, noting a few different communities. Upper left, Encino Hills. Upper right is San Fernando Valley, Panorama City area. Lower left is Wilshire Canyon in Westwood, and lower right is Westlake MacArthur Park area. And here's some numbers that I would tie with each of these areas. The upper number in each of these boxes is the average age that someone lives in one of these communities, and the lower number is the average income for a household in one of these communities. Your zip code where you live is the single greatest determinant of how long you will live. Okay, I'll say that one more time. The zip code in which you live is the single greatest determinant of how long you will live. So when we hear folks say, oh, not in my neighborhood, I want them to go, they can go live somewhere else. They can go live somewhere else that'll accept them, or that they can get a home, they can buy a home or afford a home or whatever. In many cases, we're literally telling people, you don't get to be in my community where people live longer. You can go live in that community where people don't live as long. We're making decisions about the opportunities that people have, the access opportunities, the health that they will have, the amount of air pollution they will experience, the amount of tree canopy that they will have, the amount of access to parks that they will have, based on, in many cases, perpetuating decades and decades of what were at one time explicitly racist policies that are now just continuing to exacerbate and perpetuate those conditions. So for my druthers, single family housing is a very successful, what I call, affordable housing program, because the federal government stepped in and said, here's a bunch of money to support folks buying homes, but only if they're white. Only if they're white. And those folks who were for decades able to access those resources, they were able to build enormous amounts of wealth. The greatest indicator of someone's wealth today is not their income. It's not their parents' income. It's not even their parents' wealth. It was their grandparents' wealth. That's the greatest indicator of someone's wealth today. Was 2 generations ago their wealth. So think about 2 generations ago, we were in an era where Hattie McDaniel couldn't get into the room. It had to fight her way into the room to be able to accept her Oscar. Where we had people riding the streets because of, a black family tried to neighborhood that for decades had been only white. Those are those whose wealth determines who has wealth now. So we should be very mindful of how things perpetuate through time, that we think we've moved past it, but we're just living in the shadows. We're living in the echoes of an era where it's much more obvious. But single family housing has allowed for significant wealth building, tax write-offs, property tax restrictions for Prop 13. As a result of Prop 13, the state moved from a heavy reliance on property taxes to a much larger reliance on sales taxes and income taxes. And while the state of California has a pretty progressive sales tax program, its reliance on on sales taxes is very regressive, meaning that the people who have the highest share of burden from the state tax system are our lowest income earners. And that is largely because of Prop 13, which gave enormous benefits to almost entirely white homeowners when this was passed in 1978. You know, we hear about folks say, well, you know, it's not that we're not building enough housing. You know, it's luxury housing that's getting built, right? Like we're just the new housing really is luxury housing. But when we look at what's baked into the cost of housing today, it's largely the cost of land that's going up. It's not the cost of the housing that's going up, it's the cost of the land, because we've made it so difficult to build new housing that we're now seeing land values skyrocketing, because what little land is available for new housing construction, there's such high demand for it, and there's so little available space to build new housing that our housing prices are going way up because our land costs are going way up. This will not solve our housing crisis. We cannot continue to keep building out the edges and expect that that will solve what we need for housing today. So who's in charge in our region? LA County has 10 million residents. That would make us the 8th largest of our 50 United States. If you combine the 10 smallest states' populations, that would still be fewer people than live just in our one county. So I think that's important to sort of note context there. All of these maps are currently being changed with the exception of the cities in LA County, upper right-hand side. And I need to update these maps to reflect the more recent districts that have been approved. But our congressional, city council districts, supervisorial districts, state senate districts, state assembly districts, we have a ton of different, you know, representation based on where you're located in which place. And each one of our 88 cities has their own city council, their own planning code, their own zoning, their own public works code, you name it. So everything is very, very splintered across the region. How you change policy in a region this vast and this complicated is very, very hard to sort of conceptualize. But we have a theory of change here at Abundant Housing LA. 3 main things. We believe abundant housing is key to everyone having a home they can afford, communities being more livable and sustainable, and that we are addressing the urgent climate crisis. Not sure if any of y'all saw, but we have, there was a report from the International Panel on Climate Change in the United Nations that came out this week that said we have about 3 years to meaningfully do something about climate change. And at that point, it's baked in. We are headed toward climate crisis rapidly. And Abundant Housing LA has this as one of our key 3 things that we need to address as part of our theory of change. On the point about everyone having a home they can afford, going back to that 2015 Legislative Analyst Housing Report, they said building less housing and people demand drives high housing costs. You know, pretty obvious, I think, for some folks. They did say that affordable housing programs have a role as a supplement to broader changes, but that policies need to be changed to allow more private housing construction in our coastal urban areas. Going back to that chart that I showed, where in LA metropolitan statistical area, we have the fewest number of homes per person of any of the 30 largest areas in the country. But that's what the LAO is calling out here is you got to just build more homes. Just got to build more homes. And then in terms of livability and sustainability, an analysis a few years back by the Smart Prosperity Institute in Canada looked at the cost, the municipal governance cost per household in a suburban environment versus an urban environment. So for things like libraries, streets, trash pickup, fire, police, transportation, roads, water, stormwater, sewers, you name it. In a suburban environment where homes are further spread out, it costs more than double per household what it costs for a city to provide all of these things in an urban environment, which is, for me, a very important point when we often hear people say, well, if we build more apartments, what about the water? What about the sewers? What about the power? Where are we going to get the power? You know, where are we going to get the water? The thing is that we're talking in LA especially about more housing for the people who are already here. They're not going to suddenly consume more water because they finally have the dignity of their own roof over their own head, right? But if we're forcing them to go live out on the urban fringes in, you know, some home complex that's built out in, you know, far-flung northern LA County or wherever, they're going to consume vast amounts more energy, vast amounts more water, vast amounts more. They're going to put way more carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas into the air. to be able to just continue to go to work, raise a family, put food on the table, than if we were to provide them with that same opportunity to do that, to live in central LA. So that is what this chart is really saying in terms of livability and sustainability. And finally, in terms of addressing the urgent climate crisis, I actually need to update this. We have to, we have to do a lot of things really quickly. Unfortunately, it's sort of like D-Day now for us in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And the IPCC notes that effective urban planning can reduce those emissions from urban transport between 20 and 50%. Or put differently, we can't beat the climate crisis without rethinking land use. As an article from late last year put out, simply put, the US cannot reach its greenhouse gas reduction targets if our urban areas continue to grow as they have in the past. After decades of sprawl, we had the dubious honor of being a world leader in both building-related energy consumption and vehicle miles traveled per capita. So what do we recommend as policy approaches here at Abundant Housing LA? 4 main things. Legalize more homes, make them easier to build, fund affordable housing to end homelessness, and strengthen renters' rights. Those 4 things are at the core of our pro-housing agenda for Abundant Housing LA. And if you want to get involved with Abundant Housing LA, you can become a member, you can donate, you can follow us on social. We're on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. We do have local chapters that get involved in their respective cities. We go to city and community meetings to advocate on behalf of new housing construction projects that are being proposed. And Jaime Del Rio is our field organizer, whose email is there, Jaime, Jaime, at abundanthousingle.org. Jaime at abundanthousingle.org. Shoot him an email if you want to get more involved. He's happy to plug you in. And then lastly, thank you for being here, Samantha. And I think we had one other person join us. If you want to shoot me an email, I'm at lukehklipp@gmail.com, or you can find me on Twitter at lukehklipp. I tweet about a lot of things, so my apologies. If you're only interested in housing policy, you may hear me pontificate on LGBT policy or, the weather. I like to tweet about a few things. But I'm happy to be a resource however I can. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing now. We do have Samantha and it looks like Camilo in the room. So if either of you have questions, let's see here. I don't know. If either of you have questions, you can raise your hand, or I can unmute you, or you can put it in the chat or the Q&A. So let me know. All right, Samantha, I'm going to unmute you. Hold on. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's not really a question, but I just wanted to say thank you because I personally didn't know about this stuff, especially the statistics part. I mean, I knew about like the housing crisis, but I wanted to look more into it because I just wanted to know. And what was your last name again? I need it.
Oh, sure. My last name is Klipp, Klipp.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
yeah, of course. Did you have any questions that came up as I was racing through all this stuff? I feel like I just go through it so quickly, and it's like,
no, it was really good. I didn't understand the math stuff.
Okay.
But I don't know, it's like stuff about housing is really confusing. But it's like, very shocking to hear about that stuff, especially like when you're, second generation and you like realize that like opportunities don't come to you and stuff.
Yeah.
But like, that's life, I guess.
I'm sorry?
Oh, I said that's life, I guess.
It's life, but it doesn't have to be that way. What I'm hoping is that you and other folks who participate this, who've been here in the past or come in the future, see the opportunity here to get more involved and to, really kind of chart a new path for us, because I think we get bogged down in like